It is generally agreed upon that the Roden family massacre, which is also referred to as the destruction that took place in Pike County, is one of the most significant and complicated criminal cases in the annals of Ohio's recorded history. Experts in the field of law are in agreement that this particular case is one of the most infamous and challenging cases that have ever been brought before the state of Ohio. During the month of April in 2016, 8 members of the Roden family were brutally murdered, which resulted in the beginning of a significant investigation that included 10 different states. The state of Texas was the original location where the investigation was carried out. In the course of the commission of this heinous crime, the Roden family was responsible for the deaths of 8 members of their organization. A total of more than 600 interviews were conducted with the purpose of gathering information, and the investigators were able to obtain approximately 700 witness statements throughout the course of the investigation. The magnitude of the research project that was carried out was unmatched by any other study that had been conducted. A number of hypotheses have been put forward in an effort to provide an explanation for the occurrence of events of this nature as a reaction to the terrible killings that have taken place. There are a number of hypotheses that have been proposed in order to explain the phenomenon. Some of these hypotheses include cult sacrifices, self-inflicted damage, and vengeance on the part of individuals who sell illegal substances. In spite of the enormous efforts that were being made and the numerous different avenues that were being investigated, it seemed as though the investigation had reached a point where it could no longer be brought forward any further. At least this was the situation up until the point where a solution that seemed straightforward was found. Within the scope of this narrative, the darkest depths of familial relationships are investigated, as well as the tragic unraveling of those bonds into one of the most heinous crimes that has ever taken place in Pike County, New York. This is done in order to fulfill the requirements of this narrative. Hannah Roden and Edward Jake Wagner had a sexual relationship that seemed to be absolutely risk-free when they were still in their teenage years. That relationship took place when they were both still in their teenage years. They began a romantic relationship with one another when they were both of the same age. At the time that this occurrence took place, the catastrophe that was about to take place had barely begun its initial phases of development. When Hannah first met Jake, who was 18 years old at the time, she was only 13 years old. Jake was the older of the two. Hannah was familiar with Jake and knew him well. There were 2 sons, but Jake was the older of the two. The moment that Jake kissed her for the first time was the moment that marked the beginning of their romantic connection. In order for Hannah to attend Jake's prom, she was extended an invitation. A copy of the invitation was sent to Jake. The evening in question was the moment when their lives began to get entwined with one another, which signified the beginning of their relationships from that point forward. The fact that they were so much older than one another was the source of a great deal of friction in their relationship, despite the fact that it was abundantly evident that they loved and cared for one another. In addition, it was plainly clear that they loved and cared for one another. The connection between them was fraught with a great deal of controversy as a result of this. In spite of the fact that neither of their families were able to prevent the relationship from occurring, they were still able to be together and maintain their relationship. Both the Rodens and the Wagners were successful in maintaining their ties with one another. It's likely that this was the reason for what happened because they had their own personal experiences when they were younger. This is something that might have been the cause of what happened. Despite the fact that it is impossible to overestimate the degree of dissimilarity that exists between the Roden and Wagner families in terms of their perspectives on life and the values that they hold, the degree of dissimilarity that exists between the two families is so high that it cannot be overstated. In terms of their financial standing, the Rodens did not engage in a lifestyle that could be described as exceptionally lavish. This was because Christopher Roden Sr. worked as a handyman while Dana Roden worked as a nurse's aide. Both of them were employed with the Roden family. During this particular period of time, Both of them were employed in the same sector of the economy, which was the reason for this situation. In spite of the fact that they had a limited amount of financial resources, they were able to inculcate in their 3 children a strong sense of family values and a feeling of dedication to their family. Despite the fact that they had a commitment to their family, they ended up being successful in doing this. They were successful in accomplishing their goal in spite of the fact that they had a restricted amount of financial resources. Both in terms of their demeanor and their external look, the Wagners were more traditional than other families. This was especially true when compared to other families. This was notably illustrative of the scenario when contrasted to other families in the same kind of situation. As a result of the fact that they placed a great deal of significance on their family tree and the customs that they followed, they made it a practice to transmit the names of their ancestors from one generation to the next, from one generation to the next. They did this in order to fulfill their commitment to maintain their legacy, which was stated earlier. Jake's expressions of satisfaction conveyed his contentment when Hannah disclosed that she was having a child and that she had also reached the age of 15 at the same time. Jake conveyed his contentment through his expressions of happiness. It was clear that Jake was happy with Hannah because of the announcement that she made. His conviction was that this was an extension of his family's genealogy, which is a tradition that the Wagners hold in high respect and consider to be of great value. He believed that this was a continuation of the Wagner family's lineage. Indeed, he was under the impression that this was an extension of the genealogy of his family. According to his understanding, this was something that had been handed down from generation to generation within his family. The coming of their daughter, Sophie, was a source of excitement for them from the very beginning. Nevertheless, after she arrived, it rapidly became a subject that they needed to deal with, and it became a problem for them to cope with. A heated quarrel emerged between the young couple after they had been enjoying a period of bliss together. This argument ultimately ended in the creation of a lengthy custody struggle between the two of them. During the custody struggle, Jake's growing animosity and controlling conduct were the key causes that contributed to the dispute by contributing to the conflict. This was the case because Jake was the primary component that contributed to the conflict. These factors were the key contributors to the differences that arose with regard to the custody issue of the children. Hannah came to the conclusion that it was time to stop their relationship after some time had gone, and she had gained an insight of Jake's actual intentions. She also came to the conclusion that it was time to end their relationship. She arrived at this decision after gaining an understanding of Jake's actual motives. In light of the fact that both Jake and her kid were in jeopardy, she made the decision to take this step in order to protect them both. The tensions that were previously existent between the two families continued to develop to an ever-increasing degree as a direct result of the separation that took place between them. The end of the relationship had a direct impact on this, as it was the immediate cause of the situation. In order to exercise control over Hannah's attitudes and behaviors, Jake Wagner resorted to using threats and making attempts to gain control over her. This was because he was unable to tolerate Hannah's unwillingness to sign the papers that was required for custody. Jake Wagner was irritated by Hannah's hesitation to sign the paperwork, which became a source of stress for him. It was something that Jake Wagner could not stand to allow that Hannah refused to sign the documents. He could not stand to see her not sign them. It was impossible for him to maintain his silence. As soon as Hannah disclosed that she was expecting her second child, Jake was immediately under the notion that she was carrying her second child with another guy. Her second child was her second child. There was a growing suspicion among Jake that Hannah was having an affair with another man. Due to the fact that this occurred, the level of risk that was there in the circumstance greatly escalated. Even though he did not discover any evidence that might be used against Hannah, he went ahead and hacked into her social media accounts anyway. He did this despite the fact that we did not uncover any proof. This behavior was a result of his desire to sate his sentiments of envy and mistrust, which he expressed through his actions. Hannah's fears about the unethical activities of the Wagner family were validated when she found that Jake Wagner IV, Jake's brother, had used a pistol to force another lady to give up her kid. Hannah's suspicions were validated because Jake Wagner IV committed the unethical behaviors. After obtaining this information, Hannah's suspicions were validated after being confirmed. It was abundantly evident that Hannah's worries were warranted by the evidence that was presented. In order to get another lady to agree to the situation, Jake Wagner IV had threatened her and used a weapon to force her to give up her child. He had also used the weapon to pressure her into giving up her child. The decision to fully break off all communication with the Wagners was made by Hannah because she was concerned about her own safety as well as the protection of her child that she was raising. Hannah's concerns about both of these things led to the decisions that were taken regarding this matter. The fact that she wanted to make sure that her cherished kid was safe was the driving force behind her decision to take this particular action. Jake's wrath got even more acute as a direct result of this choice, and he and his family devised a strategy to remove the Roden family from the situation in order to successfully win custody of Sophie. This plan was successful in attracting the attention of the Roden family. Through the utilization of this tactic, they were successful in achieving their main purpose. In the evening of April 21st, 2016, the Wagner individuals carried out a criminal act that had been methodically planned out by the Wagner family. This act of criminality was carried out by the Wagner individuals. The criminal activity was finally brought to a close as a consequence of this occurrence. It was anticipated that every single member of the family would fulfill a certain responsibility in order to guarantee that the plan would be carried out as intended. These tasks may involve anything from stopping the victim's phones to collecting the appropriate equipment. They may also include acquiring the necessary equipment. Because it was their duty to ensure that Sophie was not present at the site of the crime in order for them to be able to fulfill their role, they chose a time when it was their turn to care after Sophie. This was because it was their task to have Sophie not be there. On the morning of April 22, 2016, Bobby Jo Manley, who is Dana Roden's sister, came across the horrifying sight. It was in the early hours of the morning. The results of her investigation revealed that she found the remains of Christopher Roden Sr. and his cousin Gary, both of whom had been found inside of a trailer. Both of these individuals had been found inside of the trailer. During the course of her search for further members of the Roden family, she came upon additional remains in the residential neighborhoods where they lived. She then proceeded to look for additional bodies, which was the next step that she took. There is evidence that the victims were slain while they were asleep with silencers, according to the findings of the investigation that was carried out by the police. The findings show that there is proof that the victims were killed. In accordance with the findings of the investigation, this is evidence that the execution was carried out with intentional and premeditated intent. A total of 8 members of the Roden family were slaughtered in the massacre, with the exception of the children who were younger than 18 years old. The children were not among those who were killed. It was determined that the Roden family, with the exception of the children, was slaughtered. Were found at 3 of the crime locations, which led to speculation regarding the participation of drug trafficking. This discovery was made possible as a result of the early investigation that was conducted. The findings of the study led to the discovery of cannabis farms, which had not been known about before. During the month of January in 2017, a member of the Roden family was found guilty of drug trafficking and sentenced to prison. This provided this proposal with some support and helped it gain some traction for future consideration. Additional discussion on this proposition can be found in the paragraphs that follow. The quantity of cannabis that was found, on the other hand, was not adequate to indicate that a cartel was responsible for the attack, and the concept was finally rejected as a result of this analysis by the time it was completed. Another potential explanation that was taken into account was the fact that the Roden family was participating in the unlawful activity of cockfighting. In view of the fact that specialist equipment and fighting cocks were found in the dwellings of the Roden family, this was taken into consideration before making a decision. In view of the fact that the investigators could not find any solid evidence that linked cockfighting to the deaths, this hypothesis was also determined to be erroneous during the course of the investigation. As a result of this, it was demonstrated that this concept is not accurate. In spite of the considerable efforts that were put out, the investigation was unsuccessful in locating leads that were pertinent to the case. During the month of April in 2017, the local police department admitted that they did not possess sufficient evidence to successfully make any arrests whatsoever. In spite of the fact that they put in a considerable amount of effort, these results were achieved. It is important to note that this was the case despite the fact that the investigation led to the discovery of significant information. Despite the fact that there was no evidence to imply that any progress was being made in the investigation, it seemed as though the investigation had reached a level where there was no possibility of making any further advancements. Over the course of the month of June in 2017, the inquiry focused its emphasis on the Wagner family, which ultimately resulted in a key breakthrough in the investigation process about the case. When conducting searches at their residences, it was found that there was evidence that may be utilized against them when the searches were completed. These pieces of evidence were discovered during the course of the searches that were carried out. Furthermore, this evidence included search terms that were relevant to guardianship, as well as footwear that matched the tread patterns that were collected at the crime scenes where they were found. Additionally, this evidence included footwear that was found at the crime site. All things considered, the evidence that was offered here was fairly convincing. The Wagners indicated that they were having a tough time remaining in Ohio during this time period, despite the fact that they had relocated to Alaska during this time period. This was despite the fact that they had moved to Alaska during this time period. They were compelled to return to Ohio since they were having a difficult time earning enough money to cover their expenses. The reason for their choice to return to Ohio was because of this occurrence. On November 13, 2018, the members of the Wagner family were taken into jail, and allegations were made against them for both plotting and carrying out the killings and for their involvement in both of these activities. When they were arrested, they were taken into jail because of the claims that were made against them. The claims that were presented against them in the future were based on both of these violations, which served as the foundation for those allegations. In addition, Rita Newcomb and Frederica Wagner were both taken into custody after charges of perjury and obstruction of justice were brought against them. Both of these men were taken into prison without further delay. Either one of them could have been the target of both of these charges. This is a valid possibility. In the course of the investigation, the Wagners' capture was a significant turning point that occurred. This was due to the fact that it shed light on the role that they played in the horrifying atrocities that took place throughout the time period that was being studied. Jake Wagner entered into a plea bargain in April of 2021, which was the initial stage in the legal proceedings that were being carried out between the concerned parties. This event served as a symbol of the beginning of the entire legal process. He disclosed the details around the crime to the authorities and admitted that he was responsible for the murders of 5 of the 8 victims in return for life sentences, rather than the death penalty for his family members. In addition, he admitted that he was accountable for the circumstances surrounding the crime. In exchange for life sentences, this conduct was carried out. The accomplishment of both of these undertakings was accomplished in exchange for sentences of incarceration for life. It was in exchange for life sentences that he finally received that he disclosed this information to the authorities. In total, there were 23 separate criminal counts for which Jake was held accountable, and he entered a guilty plea to all of them. On closer inspection, it was discovered that he was accountable for each and every one of them. He was accused of aggravated murder, burglary, conspiracy, and tampering with evidence, according to the claims that were initially brought out against him. Further, he was accused of each and every one of these actions. The charges state that he was a participant in a scheme that was under investigation. Furthermore, Angela Wagner has pleaded guilty to further charges that have been presented against her. She has entered a guilty plea. The defendant was accused of committing a number of crimes including robbery, tampering with evidence, and conspiracy to commit aggravated murder, among other offenses. In her statement, she claimed that she was responsible for the crimes that were committed, which was something that she had actively participated in. She received a sentence of 30 years in prison in exchange for the testimony that she provided against the other defendants in the case. The reason for this was that the case of murder that had been brought against her was dropped without further investigation. This result came about as a consequence of the fact that the charge of murder that had been made against her was dropped for some reason. The procedures of the trial of George Wagner IV began on the 28th of August in the year 2022. This was the beginning of the trial. The year 2022 began in a manner that was considered to be official at this point. As a result of the court's decision to find him guilty on all 22 charges, he was given a sentence of life in prison without the possibility of release. In spite of the fact that he had on multiple occasions denied any involvement in the criminal activity, this was the situation. According to the ruling that was made, he would be permanently detained for the rest of his life, and there would be no chance that he would be freed on parole. In spite of the fact that his trial is scheduled to take place in February of 2024, George Wagner III continues to insist that he is not guilty of the allegations that have been brought against him. He is adamant in his attitude. In his direction, each and every one of these allegations has been directed. To be more specific, Sophie was one of the children who avoided death as a result of the tragic catastrophe that occurred in Pike County when she was a child. Not only did this catastrophe have a long-lasting influence on the town, but it also had a huge impact on the children who were able to survive the disaster. It was the acts of the Wagners, which were driven by their desire to impose control and custody over their children, that resulted in the terrible loss of 8 lives and the destruction of a family unit. Their activities were driven by a perverted need to exercise control and custody over their situations, which was the driving force behind their actions. Even though the legal proceedings are still ongoing, the community is still saddened by the tragedy that occurred and the collective insanity that led to the Wagners performing such horrific deeds. This is the case despite the fact that the legal proceedings are still ongoing. Thank you for watching. I recommend our other crime videos.